over the vulnerable Tallacavera. Or Mr. Campbell, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to thank the Commission and your staff for the courteous and cooperative manner in which we have been treated during this very difficult phase of the startup of our wireless business. Our competitors are clearly trying to protect their multi-billion-dollar markets. However, we've been really pleased to see in the Commission's questions that you have not been unduly influenced by these parties' self-interested arguments. We are facing three very well-financed incumbents you have seen in the room, opposing us every step of the way. We of course expected this. The combination of AAL's Canadian telecom startup and operating experience and Orascom's scale and technical expertise is certainly a formidable partnership. I knew I understood the market, but I also understood it well enough to know I needed to partner with someone with experience, capital, entrepreneurial spirit, and endurance that could keep up with me. I'm a builder, and I needed a builder as a partner. That said, we would now like to talk about why we are confident our structure is compliant. Last week, the Commission focused on three major issues, namely equity, debt, and operational control. I will ask our counsel, Mr. Hank Infant, to speak first regarding the equity issue. Hank?
Thank you, Tony. Mr. Chairman, I believe that the incumbents in all parties, including the Commission, would agree that the level of total equity financing by Orascom at about 65% is within the bounds of acceptability for Canadian carriers. TELUS itself cited 3 cases where overall foreign equity financing was at about the same level as that of the Globalive wireless business. This is the first public hearing on the application of the foreign ownership rules under the Commission's new policy. However, as the Commission is certainly aware from the many compliance reviews it and Industry Canada have undertaken on a confidential basis in the past, there are certainly other cases where foreign investors have held this level of equity ownership in Canadian telecom carriers. Thus, the equity level on its own is not unusual or precedent-setting or in any way contrary to the ownership and control rules. Simply put, the ownership and control rules focus on voting shares, not overall equity. Any non-Canadians who want to invest in non-voting shares of a Canadian carrier can do so, and many have been encouraged to do so as a means of financing the growth of Canadian cable companies and others with two-tier equity structures. So we don't believe anyone, including the incumbents, would argue that this level of equity ownership on its own is a problem. Their issue, we believe, relates to the combination of this level of equity with other factors like the level of debt or possible operational contacts, and we will address those matters later in this argument. I would now like to ask Bryce Eschuk to address the debt issue, the second of the 3 major issues.
Thanks, Hank. The Commission is clearly concerned that the debt advance to Globalive Wireless by Orascom somehow operates as a control lever. You have already heard a brief summary of the significant changes Orascom has agreed to in order to address that concern. Security date of the loans. As the new documents filed with the Commission indicate, the first major change is that Globalive now has the unilateral ability to extend the loans for up to an additional 36 months at the same terms and at the same or better interest rates. This grants to Globalive Wireless an extension to August 5th, 2014 of loans with no covenants and no ability for the lender to require additional terms. The very notion of Orascom calling its own loans when it has the level of economic interest that it does is absurd unless Orascom's goal is to put the venture into bankruptcy and have Bell Canada offer 50 cents on the dollar for its spectrum. In this particular case, any notion of debt as a control lever is eliminated by the fact that the equity holder who would suffer the largest loss would be the very entity calling the loan. Even if that were not the case, these additional concessions eliminate any reasonable concern that these loans carry with them any element of control. The terms and conditions of the loans. The right to extend the loans to August 2014, as described above, would be illusory if Orascom were able to exact stringent conditions or dramatically raise the interest rate or take such other actions at the time of renewal. As alluded to above, and recognizing that this would be a concern, Orascom has agreed in advance that the terms will be the same for all renewal periods, and the interest rate shall be the same or lower for all renewal periods. Globalive Wireless has the ability to pay off these loans at any time, and Orascom has indicated to you in no uncertain terms that it can hardly wait for that to occur. Nobody at this end of the table believes or expects that the loans will need to be extended. However, if they are, the Commission can clearly see that Globalive Wireless will not be unduly pressured by Orascom, as the terms and conditions are already set. These terms and conditions, by the way, are likely the lightest the Commission has ever seen or is likely to ever see. They are certainly the lightest I have ever seen. I'm going to digress from my written comments and prepared remarks for a second to move to a point that was addressed by the incumbents talking about Section 7(1)(f) of the loan agreements. At the break, I spoke with my counterparts at Orascom, AAL, and Globalive Wireless, and we realized that we had made an error in not deleting that section. That was an administrative and an inadvertent error on our part, and we have agreed collectively that that section will be deleted. So the references around the material adverse change and so on have now been removed from the loan agreement. Agreements. Sorry.
And you will file amended documents to that effect?
Yes, sir. To carry on. And while Mr. Infend can elaborate, my understanding is that there is no rule limiting the debt held by non-Canadians absent control levers like negative or affirmative covenants or conversion privileges. Such terms are nowhere to be found in these loans. The circumstances of how Orascom got into this situation have been outlined in detail. It is abundantly clear that every party to this transaction has a strong incentive to reduce Globalive Wireless's reliance on Orascom's debt financing. We have gone into great detail, particularly in the in-camera, regarding our efforts to do so. However, even Rogers witness Lorraine Daly admitted that realistically there would be no other financing available to a company like Globalive Wireless today or during the period since immediately following the auction. So it may take a little time, but you have everyone's commitment that we are trying to move that debt off Orascom's books as soon as possible. We do not suggest that we are not currently compliant, and this would be an effort to come into compliance. We are suggesting that these loans were never intended to be and do not operate as control levers over the wireless business. TELUS, since the hearing of last week wrapped up, sent the Commission an unsolicited piece of evidence containing a press release indicating that Public Mobile, another AWS new entrant, had apparently found some new private equity backing in addition to the possible $50 million that it may have attracted from OMERS. TELUS concludes by stating that it hopes that this information will be useful to the Commission in reaching its final determination on the compliance of Globalive with the Canadian ownership and control regime. As I trust I addressed sufficiently in the in-camera session last week, this press release, with its suspect timing, is anything but helpful to the Commission in this regard. The insinuation appears to be that Globalive is being picky or not trying sufficiently hard to replace its reliance on Orascom. This is nonsensical. The Commission has heard from banking experts who have told them of the difficult market conditions. Those bankers have also spoken to making apples-to-apples comparisons. To elaborate on comparables, even TELUS acknowledged that the other operators who have raised capital were in fact wireless add-ons to established incumbent terrestrial operations of enormous scale. In other words, they actually compared their own ability to raise funds in this market to that of a standalone greenfield operator. We do not expect that the Commission will find this self-serving comparison compelling. Bell Canada and TELUS have each again raised the specter of precedent. We think it is good policy and good for Canada and Canadian consumers if a non-Canadian lender is prepared to loan hundreds of millions of dollars in the toughest market conditions to Canadian carriers without any protection whatsoever. However, the reality is we highly doubt you will ever see another situation like this with a foreign lender. This case turns completely on its facts, and Mr. Biebick's hypothetical example would never happen. Once we are approved, we would encourage his finance team to try and find that type of financing and see how that goes. The incumbents argue the combination of debt and equity interest held by Orascom evidences too much control. That is, even if each of the components standing alone is acceptable, this combination is still somehow offensive. They even tried to add the two numbers together to come up with some kind of metric. The Commission should have no difficulty in seeing through this strained exercise of new math. There are no control levers with respect to Orascom's non-voting equity, and there are no control levers with respect to the debt. The sum of two zeros is still zero. Even the incumbents have provided no argument as to why their tortured aggregation equals control. Tony?
Thank you, Bryce. I'd like to speak very quickly to a question that has come up from this commission and during this hearing several times during the course of the hearing. This issue is a critical one, especially, but not solely, from an AAL perspective. The Commission will notice that we have not offered any substantial constraints on the time frame or terms on which we will accept additional financing. As we hope is very apparent, we have done all that we reasonably can to address the Commission's concerns in this regard. But the types of potential constraints we discussed last week, such as a time frame within which we must raise additional capital, cannot be accepted and simply will not be accepted by any Globalive Wireless shareholder. To accept such terms would crush Globalive Wireless, and even more so, it would crush AAL. We cannot accept financing on commercially unreasonable terms, and we cannot negotiate commercially reasonable terms under duress. I'd now like to pass to Ken to discuss the operational issues. Ken?
Thank you, Tony. Mr. Chairman, Commissioner Menzies, Commissioner Katz. Last week saw us complete our first tower in Calgary. We also placed our first call here in Ottawa. We also started hiring store managers in Toronto. This was accomplished by the people at Globalive Wireless, without shareholder involvement, without shareholder control. I told you last week when I was here that I was the one who was running the business on a day-to-day basis. Nothing has changed. We have now grown to 277 employees, many of whom I expect, unfortunately, since we have much work to do, are glued to the audio feed of this transmission, this session. The picture the incumbents are trying to paint of Orascom controlling the wireless business is simply divorced from reality. They are either being disingenuous or they are seriously mistaken. And while I try not to take this personally, the suggestion that anyone other than my team and I are managing this business is inaccurate and offensive. It is entirely understandable that between February 2008 and our projected launch date later this year, there was a need for some amount of support from Orascom. That has now been largely accomplished, as could be demonstrated if you walk through our offices at Queen's Quay in Toronto or in North Vancouver, or up the road here in Canada. That said, our shareholders made a number of important changes to the documentation that has now been filed with the Commission. The most important change is that the Orascom Technical Services Agreement, the TSA, has been amended to provide for termination by Globalive at any time. If ever there were a change that proved that this is not a control element, this is it. We heard you loud and clear. That same provision was, of course, added to the AAL Telecom and Strategic Consulting Agreement, and neither agreements, there's a mistake on the transcript, neither agreements have minimum payments in the event of termination pursuant to this new right. As the Commission is aware, these were dual-purpose agreements, so a provision was inserted to ensure that, if either party's agreement was terminated, the parties would need to negotiate the new arrangements to preserve the equivalent economic benefits and tax efficiencies. However, there were and are already a variety of reasons why the Commission should not view the current operations as being controlled in any way by Orascom. First, the TSA, the Technical Services Agreement, is non-exclusive. We can and we have gone elsewhere for consultancy services. We do not always agree with Orascom, as is the case with many consultants and even some counsel. We have on many occasions thanked them for their advice and taken a different direction. Second, while the incumbents have suggested that the TSA was dictated by Orascom as a condition of investment in the company, The evidence contradicts this. Mr. Lacavera was insistent that he have the ability to leverage Orascom's experience and buying power, and went so far as to append a draft to the original investment agreement. The fact that management can ignore their advice or even refrain from seeking it at all ought to dispel any doubt. Third, the incumbents have argued that access to Orascom's buying power, which is one of the key benefits that Globalive gains through the TSA, is somehow a point of control. The notion that I can get a great deal on equipment means that Orascom has control over Globalive is ludicrous. What it means is that Globalive will be able to pass on lower costs to Canadian consumers. I understand why that thought must be terrifying to the incumbents, but where is the control? The incumbents have strongly argued against the branding agreement. Because the Commission granted confidentiality over the key provisions that the incumbents are speculating about, only we and the Commission know how dead wrong they are. They have acknowledged the branding agreement can act as a control point only if the term of the agreement is short, if the agreement can be terminated easily or on short notice, or if there are important restrictions on the use of the brand. Since these details have been filed in confidence, we invite the Commission to apply the test set out by the incumbents and to draw its own conclusions. Notwithstanding all of the above, TELUS states that Orascom's intention is clearly to run Globalive as an Orascom company. This is false and can be clearly seen by the evidence. And now I'd like to turn to Tony, who'd like to speak about the issue of experience relative to that of Orascom.
Thanks, Ken. The incumbents have all made comments about my own and my team's size and experience relative to Orascom's. Let me begin by saying that I don't take any of this personally. I have been working with and competing with the incumbents for over a decade. I have developed a thick skin and a healthy respect for the lengths they will go to deflect or impede new competition. So their comments and innuendo do not affect me at all. They know me, and I know them. That said, they have put their comments on the record of this hearing, and so my advisors have suggested that I respond. As I hope has become clear to the Commission throughout this process, anyone who has worked with me or for me or has competed against me in the marketplace could not seriously maintain that I don't have what it takes to succeed in Canadian telecom. My team and I have already succeeded. If the Commission examines the experience of Orascom and AAL seriously, it will see that we have complementary skill sets and experience bases. The Commission should bear in mind that the AAL team has 11 years of experience in the Canadian telecom market, starting and operating telecom companies, which is 11 years more than Orascom. Maybe 11 or 12 years of experience doesn't sound like much to the Commission. If so, I would remind the Commission that Orascom has been around for no longer than this either. I believe that Hank wants to speak to the legal aspects of what, quite frankly, strikes me as a topic that has received altogether too much attention. Hank?
Thank you, Tony. During their presentation, TELUS invited the Commission to consider the CRTC's Unitel decision as an acceptable precedent compared to the Globalive one, because the non-Canadian company AT&T's experience was balanced by that of two experienced Canadian partners, Rogers and CP. TELUS implied that this balancing of experience allowed the Commission to determine that Unitel was Canadian-owned and controlled, notwithstanding that AT&T was a large non-Canadian investor with a strategic interest. The implication is that there is no corresponding counterweight to Orascom's size, and therefore the Commission ought to assume that Orascom is therefore in charge. As the Commission will see if it rereads the Unitel decision, TELUS's description is not accurate. At the time the CRTC reviewed Unitel's ownership and control, Rogers and CP had already exited the business. The Canadian investors that the Commission considered in the Unitel case were three Canadian banks. These banks clearly had far less operating telecom experience than AAL does, as you've just heard Tony say. Nonetheless, the Commission did not find that its greater level of experience than the banks led to a conclusion that AT&T controlled Unitel. The point is not a compelling one in any event. Size is not the issue. Control is. Obviously, ESPN is bigger than CTV. Goldman Sachs is bigger than CanWest. So are Hearst or BBC and many other minority investors in regulated Canadian entities larger than their Canadian partners. But that is not enough. You have to look at the control elements. There is nothing preventing smaller Canadian licensees or carriers from doing perfectly acceptable deals with larger non-Canadian entities, as long as the latter understand that they cannot control the venture and govern themselves accordingly.
Can I ask you to change seats because he can't hear you? Use the other mic, please.
You've heard Mr. Sawira say that he knew from the very beginning that he could not control Globalive, and Rascom has governed itself in accordance with his instructions. I would now propose to address certain matters relating to the corporate structure and the board of directors of the wireless venture. Mr. Chairman, as you've heard, the shareholders have agreed to make some very substantial changes to the corporate structure and governance. These changes simplify the ownership structure and clarify the locus of control of the business. The changes should dispel any remaining concerns about the potential for non-Canadian control of the business. Let me summarize the key changes briefly. First, Tony Lacavera will become the chair of each of the boards of the holding company and the operating wireless company. Future chairs will be chosen by those boards. Those future chairs will be either Tony or an independent Canadian director. Second, the intermediate holding company, which was originally part of the corporate structure, has been eliminated. The wireless and wireline operating companies will now be 100% owned directly by the parent holding company. This means that the overall levels of the voting and equity shareholdings of Rascom, AAL, and Mojo in the Globalive group of companies will be unchanged, but they'll be consolidated and transparent at the holdco level. The third change deals with the independent directors. The first independent director has already been selected by AAL, and as you've heard, AAL selected Bruno Ducharme for that role. Other independent directors will be nominated by a committee comprised of the longest-serving independent director, one AAL nominee director, and one Rascom nominee director. The partners have also established a clear requirement that the independent directors shall be experienced directors, for which a definition was added. This change will help ensure good corporate governance. The experienced independent directors will help ensure that the companies operate in accordance with the law, including the Canadian ownership and control rules. They will also assist in implementing the plans to access the capital markets to reduce reliance on the Rascom debt and bring on new equity investors. Now, I'll depart from the written text here, Mr. Chairman, to address one point that Bell made in argument. They argue that somehow in the Globalive structure, the Canadian shareholder doesn't hold rights that the Unitel shareholders, the banks, held in the case of the Unitel transaction, and suggested that the banks had a right through special resolution to approve the independent directors. Well, if you look at it carefully, the situation is precisely the same in the Globalive transaction. Here, the documentation has been prepared in such a way that both shareholders, including OT, are compelled to accept the independent directors selected by the nominating committee. So the net effect is the same. In Unitel, as in this case, the nominating committee will select the independent directors, and the foreign shareholder must go along with that selection. Now, the fourth change I'd like to highlight is that at the holding company level,
The board of directors will be comprised of 11 directors, as you've heard, 4 nominated by AAL, 4 by OTH, and 3 independents. All AAL nominees and independent directors must be independent Canadians and shall remain independent Canadians at all times while they are members of the board. Each independent director shall serve for annual terms, and any independent director's replacement shall be nominated by the nominating committee. The membership of the Globalive Wireless Board, the operating company, will be essentially the same as the holding company, except that at least 2 of the nominees of Orascom shall be resident Canadians. And so at least 2 of the nominees of Orascom and all of the nominees of AAL shall be members of the holding company board. The parties have also clarified a few points that were raised by the Commission during the hearing. First, they've clarified the fact that the CEO of Globalive Wireless, Ken Campbell, reports to the board of directors of the company. They have clarified that the term managing director means the same as CEO, as distinguished from chairman. And any references to the strategic plan have been corrected to refer to the business plan. That was a mere correction. So with these changes, we believe that the Globalive Wireless structure has addressed all of the legitimate concerns about structure and board membership. I would now like to ask Simon Lochte to speak to the liquidity rights of the shareholders.
Thank you, Hank. I don't propose to lecture the Commission about the reasonableness and ubiquity of shareholder liquidity rights. I will say, however, that such rights are certainly in all of the many shareholders' agreements I have negotiated with and without Tony. Any business person both insists on their presence in a shareholders' agreement for their own benefit, but also understands that their partners deserve such provisions as well. Everybody enters a deal with the hope and expectation that the relationship will be a success. But business prudence requires building processes to deal with the eventuality that it is not. We would always rather have such provisions and never use them than find ourselves in a bad situation without them. We have heard the Commission's concerns with respect to the existing exit mechanisms. These have been removed in their entirety and replaced with a simple, single, and mutual liquidity right for both parties. This new mutual liquidity right is not effective until a point in the future, although the precise date is confidential. I will refer to it today as the effective date. I'd like to walk you through it quickly. At any time after the effective date, either AAL or Orascom may, by issuing an exit notice, exercise its liquidity right and, subject to the right of first refusal in favor of the other shareholders, sell all of its respective shares to an eligible purchaser, which may be the non-selling party of the two. The notifying party has 12 months from delivering its exit notice to identify an eligible purchaser to purchase its shares. For Orascom, this purchaser need not be a resident Canadian. If AAL is the notifying party and exercises in the first year of the liquidity right and sells its shares to an eligible purchaser within a 12-month period, AAL will receive the greater of the fair market value of the shares and an agreed-upon floor outcome. If the notifying party cannot identify an eligible purchaser within a 12-month period, the other party can arrange for a sale of the notifying party's shares, again, subject to the right of first refusal in favor of the other shareholders. If AAL is the notifying party in such case and has exercised this liquidity right in the first year only, in order to provide certainty to AAL in the event that the ability to sell AAL's interest moves to Orascom and GIHC, and to ensure Orascom and GIHC's motivation to complete that sale, Orascom will loan AAL an amount equal to the greater of the fair market value of AAL's shares in the agreed floor outcome, pending purchase of such shares or GIHC by an eligible purchaser. Fair market value for the purposes I have just outlined will be by an independent investment bank. The parties have agreed that GIHC will select one of 2 acceptable banks. If neither of those banks agree to enter into that engagement, or if both have a conflict at that time, an investment bank will be agreed to by the parties or determined by arbitration. Ken will now address the issue of vetoes.
Thank you, Simon. As you will recall, I had indicated last week that in my experience, the thresholds that we had agreed to with Industry Canada were not overly restrictive. Indeed, there had only been a handful of cases where management had sought Orascom's consent thus far. Notwithstanding this fact, the parties have now made changes to the veto section of the shareholders' agreement to allay any concerns the Commission may have had with those vetoes. These changes, I believe, provide management with even greater flexibility in the operation of this business. These include the following changes. Point 1. An ordinary course of business definition has now been inserted using the BCE decision as a precedent. Point 2. The veto thresholds have been increased as follows. Expenditures, liabilities, or guarantees from $10 million to $22.1 million. Material contracts from $5 million to $22.1 million. Repurchase, prepayment, redemption, or other acquisition of debt securities of the corporation from $1 million to $22.1 million again. Incurred indebtedness from $20 million to $22.1 million. Point 3. The following Part 2 vetoes were amended. Paragraph A was amended so that an employee stock option plan for up to 5% of the shares of GIHC or GWMC is exempted from the veto. Paragraph C was amended to remove the reference to the portion of the business plan applicable to the non-wireless business. Point 4. The following Part 1 veto was deleted. Paragraph 1, material change to the portion of the business plan related to the non-wireless business. Now, the incumbents have tried to argue that the former thresholds were so low that they amounted to Orascom control over Globalive Wireless business. They did not then, and they especially do not now. I also want to address Bell's assertion last week that all of the really important decisions have been made, and so therefore the damage, in some sense, is done. Not only is the conclusion Bell reaches rather absurd, and I'm assured by our counsel fundamentally mistaken as a matter of law, the premise is equally wrong. It is simply not true that all of the really important decisions of this business have already been made. Those decisions were not made by Orascom. They were made by me, they were made by my team, and we continue to make key decisions every day.
Mr. Chairman, I'd now like to speak about the test for control in fact that is set out in the Telecom Act. The submission of the incumbents contains a lot of allegations that Globalive is controlled by Orascom. These submissions are long on rhetoric, but in our respectful submission falls short of providing any specific evidence or logical analysis to show that Orascom can actually exercise control in fact over the Globalive business. Last week, we and other parties cited the Canadian Airlines case, which is the precedent the Commission has used to define control in fact. As we discussed, that case makes it clear that the ability of non-Canadian investors to influence the business is not sufficient to support a finding of control by non-Canadians. And since this test is so important, I'll just read it to you briefly again. The decision indicates that control in fact generally can be viewed as the ongoing power or ability, whether exercised or not, to determine the strategic decision-making activities of an enterprise, or to manage and run the day-to-day operations of an enterprise. The decision also states that minority shareholders and their designated directors normally have the ability to influence a company, as do others, such as bankers and employees. The influence, which can be exercised either positively or negatively by way of veto rights, needs to be dominant or determining, however, for it to translate into control in fact. So that's the test that we submit the Commission should apply carefully to the facts before it. Based on this, it's clear that the proper test is to ask whether the non-Canadian investor has the ability to unilaterally determine strategic decision-making or to dominate decisions regarding the day-to-day operations of an enterprise. The ability to influence strategy or operations is simply not enough. The submissions of the incumbents have generated a lot of smoke about things that they view as suggestive of control by a RASCOM. But while there has been a lot of smoke, there is no fire. They have not provided evidence of a single mechanism or arrangement that gives a RASCOM the clear power to determine or to dominate either day-to-day operations or corporate strategy. No doubt, a RASCOM's 65% equity level, non-voting equity level in large part, its large loans, and its arrangement to provide consulting services give a RASCOM the ability to exert some influence on operations or strategy. But the Canadian Airlines decision makes it clear that it is not enough to make a finding of control. Such influence must be dominant, I remind you, or determining to amount to control. There is simply no evidence of any arrangement, certainly not after all the changes that have been made, that would give a RASCOM such control. The incumbents also seem to be arguing that even if no single arrangement gives a RASCOM control over Globalive, the cumulative effect of such arrangements must be seen to amount to control. Their argument is not logical, and it should be rejected. It's like saying that even if we don't have a 10-foot plank to get across a 9-foot gap, we can get there by having a bunch of 4-foot planks. It simply can't be done. You cannot accumulate a number of different arrangements that do not grant control, and then say the sum of those arrangements nevertheless grants control. We would encourage the Commission to be rigorous in its analysis of the arrangements between RASCOM, AAL, and Globalive Wireless, and reject the fuzzy concept that because there is high non-voting equity investment, a large bridge loan, plus a consulting agreement, none of which grant control in themselves, that taken together they might amount to control. That is not logical. The equity doesn't confer control because it is mostly non-voting. The debt doesn't confer control because there are no covenants or other control levers attached to it, and it can be replaced as soon as the company can find alternative financing. And the consulting agreement does not confer control because it's purely advisory and can be terminated at any time for any reason. Since none of these or any other arrangements confer control in themselves, it cannot be said that somehow when put together they confer control. Bell's well-worn maxim that the CRTC should follow the money to find where control lies is catchy, but it's fuzzy logic. It's not compelling in law. There are lots of examples in Canadian business and certainly in the communications sector where investors put in most of the money but don't control a business. This is the case, in fact, with many of the broadcasting entities and the cable and other businesses that have two-tier share structures, such as Rogers, Astral, Shaw, and many others. And it's certainly the case that many Canadian communications enterprises rely very heavily on foreign debt in the U.S. debt markets primarily, but also in the global markets. In those cases, the foreign debt holders have put up, in many cases, very substantial amounts of money, but they don't control the business. Moving along to another legal issue. We have discussed the wording of Section 16.3 of the Telecom Act. As we discussed, those words plainly say that a corporation is considered to be Canadian-controlled for telecom purposes if it is not controlled by non-Canadians. These words do not say that the test is that the company must be controlled by Canadians. As we have discussed, this is different from the ownership and control test in the Broadcasting Act. Mr. Chairman, you will recall that when you questioned Mr. Ryan about this issue, you quoted from my interpretation of subsection 16.3 of the Act and said, and I quote, it is not a question of whether it is controlled by Canadians, it is a question of whether it is not controlled by non-Canadians. And he makes a big deal out of that. What is your position on that? And Mr. Ryan answered, "I think that Mr. Infant is quite correct in telling you that the test is whether the company is not controlled by non-Canadians, or is controlled by non-Canadians. I'm getting lost in my double negatives," he said, "but Mr. Infant was right in the position that he put to you in that respect, and I think the Commission said as much in the Unitel case." End of quote. So as you can see, Mr. Ryan and I agree on the proper interpretation of Section 16. I don't believe there's any magic in the interpretation. It's clear from the plain words of the Act. As we discussed during last Thursday's hearing, the new structure proposed for the Globalive wireless companies has a board of directors, of which there are 4 members appointed by the Canadian shareholder, 4 by the non-Canadian, and 3 independents, of which the first is appointed by the Canadian. Under this structure, the non-Canadian investor simply cannot control the board, and thus the structure must be seen to pass the test in subsection 16.3. Finally, on another legal issue, we have previously pointed out that the Canadian ownership and control rules set out in Section 16 of the Telecom Act only apply to companies once they are operating as telecom common carriers. That is what subsection 16.1 says. The rules do not apply to any pre-operational arrangements or work. And, Mr. Chairman, I might digress here to say that while Bell has made a big point of the fact that the horse is out of the barn, or that's their theory, and that pre-operational influences by Orascom somehow have tainted the business irreparably. I was pleased to see during the argument of the other parties that they don't take that position, and I think generally acknowledge that the proper time for the application of the control test is once a company is operational. And so
we don't question that to that point.
We don't. Okay, so I will not continue with the rest of the comments I had in reply to Bell. I think it's accepted by most people. I would like, Mr. Chairman, to deal with another point, and that is the fairness point. Some of the incumbents have argued that it would somehow be unfair to approve the Globalive wireless ownership structure, with its heavy reliance on financing from a single foreign strategic investor. The argument seems to be that Globalive is looking for regulatory treatment that would not be available to others. This is a red herring. Nobody is asking for any special treatment. In fact, Globalive agrees with the incumbents that the rules should be the same for all. Globalive has never asked for a ramp-up period or some special treatment during its early stages. It understands that that is not the way the law is written. The reality is that the incumbent operators do not need to enter into financing arrangements like Globalive has been forced to enter into due to the economic circumstances over the past year. The incumbents run mature, proven businesses, and they have no trouble raising capital on terms that are far more favorable than a greenfield wireless startup like Globalive. They do not need to go to a shareholder for bridge financing or to start up or to stay in business. They do not have to pay the high interest rates that normally attach to such new venture funding. If the incumbents think it is unfair to allow Globalive to have such financing arrangements, I'm sure that Globalive would be pleased to swap their loans and interest rates for the type of borrowing terms available to the incumbents. The so-called fairness argument is illusory. There's nothing to it. That said, I'm sure you'll appreciate the irony of the position that the incumbents are taking. Many Canadian telecom carriers started up their business with the help of foreign capital. Bell Canada was started by Charles Fleetford Sykes, an American agent for the National Bell Telephone Company of Boston, who came up to Canada to start Bell Canada. The BC part of TELUS, then BC Tel, undertook its major expansion in the 1920s when it was owned by Theodore Gary, an American whose National Telephone and Telecom Corporation eventually devolved into the Anglo-Canadian Telephone Company, which was subsequently owned by US-based GT&E, based in Connecticut. AT&T was instrumental in the establishment of Unitel, which subsequently became Allstream. And in his memoirs, Ted Rogers concedes that he had issues with compliance with the Canadian ownership rules during the high-debt, high-growth days of his business, and the list goes on. It is ironic to hear the incumbents complaining now that someone else might be looking to a major foreign investor to do exactly what they did themselves at an earlier stage in their history. This was during the stage when they established their businesses. But Globalive is not looking for equal treatment with them. It recognizes that the rules changed in 1993. It is merely looking for fair treatment under the current rules, treatment based on a fair and rigorous interpretation of the rules, not an interpretation that is based on unsubstantiated fears of foreign investors controlling a business through means that no one has demonstrated. Mr. Chairman, we're aware of the fact that the Commission's new policy for public review of Type 4 ownership situations is aimed at providing guidance for future and other investment in the telecom industry. And we're also aware that some of the parties have, and did again in their arguments a few minutes ago, suggest that if it was approved, the Globalive structure could set a precedent that would lead to more cases where non-Canadian strategic investors provided most of the equity and all of the debt for a new Canadian carrier. This has led to some concerns about the precedent effect of your decision in this case. We don't think the Commission should be concerned about setting an inappropriate precedent, and we say this for several reasons. First, you must recognize that the Erascom precedent is not a very attractive one for any foreign investor to follow. And you have Mr. Marouz on the video link if you want to question that any further. That is perhaps the greatest understatement in this argument. How many foreign investors would want to lend over $500 million to a wireless startup, strip all the covenants and other conditions from their loan, and then agree to have it extended for 5 years from the present time at the sole option of the borrower? How many would like to have their veto thresholds set at the very high levels of the amended shareholders agreement, or make the other concessions that Globalive shareholders have made? Not very many, probably none. Second, in terms of the precedent effect, it should be remembered that every case is different and should be considered based on the relevant facts and circumstances. The Globalive case occurred during a very unique set of circumstances, ones that are clearly distinguishable and unlikely to occur again. And finally, it should be kept in mind that the telecom ownership and control rules, and particularly subsection 16.3 of the Telecom Act, are different from the broadcasting rules. So this case will not act as a precedent for any broadcasting investment. We recognize that the Canadian policy concerns over foreign ownership have a much longer, deeper, and I would suggest more logical basis in the broadcasting area due to the related cultural and nation-building concerns. We hope the Commission's review is complete and that the parties, especially Erascom, have given you enough comfort on this set of facts with this set of players, and that based on that you can approve the arrangements to fulfill the goal of the Government of Canada, a goal shared by many Canadians, namely to add a new competitive spark to our wireless markets. And I will now ask Ken to conclude our remarks.
Thanks, Hank. Although we have outlined the changes, we have attached for ease of reference the redacted term sheet as a reminder of just how far the parties have gone to satisfy the concerns we heard expressed last week. I'd like to leave you with a few final thoughts. Globalive Wireless is the only new entrant that is national in scope and which comes with the backing of a large international player. This is a capital-intensive business where scale matters. Incumbents know this. They know that access to capital is a competitive advantage. Tony Lacavera knows this as well. He knew it when he started knocking on doors, seeking an international partner, and he certainly knows it today. His success in securing this partnership is a success for himself, it's a success for Erascom, it's a success for our employees, and most of all, it's a success, we hope, for Canadian consumers who deserve a very new and a very different wireless choice. As you've heard, we represent a unique threat. Make no mistake, this is what is behind the incumbent's initiation of interference with participation in this hearing. The reality is that Orascom does not control this business. Canadians started it, Canadians are running it, Canadians are managing it, and Canadians control it. I trust, along with my shareholders, with my board, and with my team, that the Commission sees this as clearly as we do. Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation. First of all, I have a question for you, Mr. Marouz. We've gone through the term sheet. This transaction, as a result of this hearing, has been restructured considerably. You yourself, Mr. Campbell, just mentioned extensively in light of this, etc. Yet I've heard from Orascom, from Mr. Saveris, that they never wanted to be lender. They didn't. They're only lender by default. They really were. Then why did we have all these provisions in here? Why these elaborate control provisions, which are now have all fallen by the way? If you don't want to be controlling shareholders, if you're just an equity investor and in a foreign country and you realize you have to be a minority, you can't control, why then all of these provisions, which when the spotlight was put on them fell away, like snow melting in the sunshine?
Well, I think it's probably because when we drafted all these loan agreements, we used standard precedents, and frankly speaking, we did not really think through that this wouldn't be interpreted as control from the Commission. And when we really dig into it, we thought that all these provisions were necessary, and we were very happy to give them away because this was not that crucial for us. So this basically becomes from a standard, kind of loan documentation that we use, that probably take from one of the loans we have with a bank, and we just by thinking about it, we took all the provisions that were not necessary to us.
But when I asked him, Mr. Mario, on the anti-dilution right, Mr. Saveris said he always wanted to have as much equity as possible, for instance. And yet that anti-dilution right is gone. It's now down to 40%, etc. There seems to have been a major change in heart here by the majority equity holder.
Yeah, I think this anti-dilution provision was mostly done for a reason when if and when the law changes. If it doesn't change, we have no issue. So I think this is probably, as the structure is, because it has to comply with all the regulation. It sometimes becomes a little bit complicated, and some things we frankly speaking we did not think through them, and they were not that important. So really, when we heard your remarks and we really thought through all the implications, we were very happy to give them away because it was not our initial intention.
Mr. Lacavera, you state on page 6 that you feel that the legal aspect is a topic that has received altogether too much attention. Isn't this what it's all about? Aren't we supposed to determine whether in law and in fact you control this corporation or not?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. I think what I was referring to there was the comparison of the relative size of the shareholders in the context of the relative experience of the shareholders question. I know that we've spent a lot of time debating those issues, and I felt that it was, at this point, gone through ad nauseum. We've made exhaustive and comprehensive changes, but we're very happy to go through them all again.
Now, you have those, in effect, exit provisions for AEL, and I'm somewhat stunned why they are there. Why do you still need them? I mean, I thought this is your adventure. I thought you are the driving force. You saw an opportunity. You found a foreign partner. You are in control of this. You have voting control, etc. And yet, there's a provision for you to exit. I just don't understand it. Isn't this your baby? Aren't you going to be Globalive?
Very much so, Mr. Chairman. It is something that I started 11 years ago, and it is very much my baby. It's a company that I've built up, built teams up over the years that we've described to you, and it's been a lot of blood, sweat, and tears to get this company to where it is today. What I think we're providing for is a mechanism, like you have in any good shareholders agreement, a mechanism for the parties to go their separate ways if things don't go as you expect.
Yeah, but you're being guaranteed a floor price here, if I understand it correctly. That's what I don't understand. If you are the one in control, you don't need a floor price. If anybody, Orascom should have the floor price.
I understand that concern, and I think I'd like to stress on that point that the floor price is in no way, to the Rogers comments and to your question, in no way de-risking the venture for me in any way. It would be a disastrous outcome for me personally and for the business if I were to have to exit it. It's a negotiated business term that the parties agreed to, but in no way do I see it as something anything other than just absolutely disastrous outcome for myself.
In terms of reputation, in terms of ego, I can understand that. In terms of money, I don't see that. But wouldn't you, in effect, because of the floor price, walk out whole?
Actually, Mr. Chairman, not at all. Obviously, it's a good sum of money that we're discussing, but it is no way representative of the existing value in my business today. I have built a business with over $120 million a year in sales that's been now recognized as one of the best managed companies in Canada for the past 5 years. I've got an incredible team around me that I've built up over the years. A financial outcome is not at all my objective here in any way. And in no way is it representative of a de-risking in any way for me. It's frankly not in any way an outcome that I'd be happy with.
A couple of technical questions. On page 5, you're talking about the terms of the TSA agreement, and the fourth paragraph, the last sentence says, as the Commission is aware, these were dual-purpose agreements, so a provision was inserted to ensure that if either party's agreement was terminated, the parties would need to negotiate a new arrangement to preserve the equivalent economic benefits and tax efficiencies. Can you elaborate? I mean, I don't want you to say anything else in concept, but just in generic terms. What does this mean?
Well, in generic terms, the fact that there's now this unfettered ability to terminate the agreement by the corporation, this secondary purpose for these agreements will have to somehow be sorted out between the shareholders otherwise, and that's just been reflected in the shareholders' agreement.
So there's an obligation to negotiate these terms in the shareholders' agreement now? Or?
I wouldn't describe it as an obligation to negotiate. There's an agreement between the shareholders that if they lose the mechanism and the vehicle for this distribution mechanism that's currently in those agreements, that they will otherwise address the economics.
If it isn't an agreement to negotiate, what is it?
It is. It's the terms. The negotiation, I guess, I would see going more to the economic benefits themselves. This is simply to come up with some other mechanism for achieving the exact same negotiated result.
Yeah, I got it. It's very simple. You tell me TSA can now be terminated, and you tell me there's no penalty for early termination. That's what you said this morning.
Correct.
When that happens, however, there will be a set of negotiations whereby the tax benefit or the economic benefit, as you call it, that Orascom gets pursuant to the TSA will have to be substituted in a way yet to be determined.
That is correct. I would just note that the decision to terminate this agreement by the corporation would itself be unfettered. What we're attempting to do is address the Commission's concern that it was operating in some way as a control lever.
I understand. I'm trying to get to the bottom of what happens. Let's assume that the termination takes place. And you now then sit down to use your words, determine equivalent economic benefits and tax efficiencies. You can't agree to this. What then? The thing goes to arbitration. Is there going to be an arbitration clause?
I can give you a very simple example of what the parties might do. They might agree that the only mechanism available will be to issue dividends for those amounts respectively. If they weren't able to come to agreement on that, you'd have a contractual dispute like any other, and I guess it would go to arbitration in accordance with the provisions of the agreement.
So this would be arbitrable. A failure to agree to negotiate these equivalent economic benefits or tax efficiencies would go to arbitration, and that will be spelled out in the TSA?
I confess
or wherever you're going to spell it out.
We haven't looked through the specifics, but I can tell you the general arbitration provision applies to any dispute under the agreement, so yes.
You're making a specific representation here. You've just explained it. I'd like to see it in writing, see how it actually works. Okay.
Understood.
And lastly, the selection of the CEO, second last, the selection of the CEO, if I understand it, he or she is going to be elected by the board. In both cases, there are no specific provisions, Mr. Infant or Mr. Locke, if I understand it, regarding the selection of the CEO.
I believe that's correct, Mr. Chairman.
It's just a question of the board selecting the CEO.
Since that's okay, and coming back to the board, the way you set it up, the first independent director is Mr. Ducharme, who's been nominated by AAL. How is Mr. Ducharme replaced if something should happen to him, or if he should resign or anything like this? Does AAL get to replace Mr. Ducharme, or does he get replaced by the selection committee?
The way the agreements work, Mr. Chairman, the process is intended to be self-perpetuating, because Mr. Ducharme, together with a nominee from AAL and OT, will now select the two remaining independents.
Yeah, but he can't replace these. But those, I understand it's self-perpetuating, but the key on which you're trying to convince me that AAL is in control is because they appointed Ducharme. So presumably they should have appointed his replacement too. Otherwise, the selection of the replacement is being watered down. So that independent committee.
Well, if Mr. Ducharme, heaven forbid, passes away or is no longer on the board,
let's say resigns. Let's just say resigns.
That's a better example. If he does, then the way the agreement is structured, the most senior, the first appointed independent as of that date will take his place on the nominating committee. And so the board is in the process right now, or the committee is in the process of selecting the two remaining independents. If they were to select John Smith and Jane Brown, John Smith would be the first independent. If Mr. Ducharme resigns, John Smith would step up to the nominating committee and then participate in the selection of future independents. That's the theory.
I assumed, maybe wrongfully, that you were trying to emulate the BC decision, or coming close to it. This is not the same. I just pointed out to you. You might want to reflect on that. Okay, Mr. Katz, do you have any questions?
Yes, I do. Mr. Lacavera, I want to take you to page 4 of your comments here. And the reference you've made quite unequivocally about the fact that you cannot accept any levers or conditions on raising debt. And then you say, towards the end, to accept such terms would crush Globalive Wireless, and even more so would crush AAL. My first questions are, in what sense would they crush those two companies? One, the operating company, and one, your personal company.
Mr. Katz. In the first instance, the concern that we would have is that a party would be negotiating with us not on a commercial basis, because that party would have knowledge that we are in a position where we either are not able to begin operations until we accept their capital, which would be the recommendations of the incumbents largely, or secondarily perhaps that we are in a situation where we are operating but we have now a certain block of debt or a certain cap or a certain structure that we have to accommodate, which, to use Mr. Sestak's words from the first hearing, would put us to the lowest common denominator in terms of that negotiation. So the issue is we need an ability to negotiate our financing on a fair and equitable basis on commercial terms. And if that means that the terms may not be what we like. We still may not be in a market that is ideal, but adding in a regulatory requirement for approval or post-approval for such a situation would create a very onerous situation for us. The related point on AAL is, of course, that now shrinking it from the global markets for a diversification of the foreign debt or a diversification of the foreign equity. Talking specifically about the Canadian shareholder, in this case AAL, we'd be put in a situation now we're dealing with a smaller universe and a small set of investors that are financially in a position to participate in a venture like this, and we would be facing an incrementally even more onerous situation for AAL.
But I guess I don't understand. If you had to move the paper, so to speak, off of Roscom's books to somebody else, there's a commercial market for it as well. It may be higher than what you're paying today, and it may cost another couple of points to move it off. But I don't understand why it would crush the company. Well, yes, it would push out your cash flow by another couple of months or whatever the case may be. But I don't understand the notion of crushing it.
I don't think it's not just necessarily a question of the cost, sir. It's also a question of the terms that would come in associated with that. Orascom has pledged a true startup funding for this business that gives the business the runway it needs to get out of the gate and get to a position where we're generating some cash flows.
But I think I heard Orascom say that they're not discounting that paper to you. You are paying full commercial rates today, which is what I asked them last week. And so if you're paying full commercial rates today, yes, if they've got to move that paper off of a Roscom, there may be another charge for a third party to take it off. But I can't see it as being that onerous at the end of the day.
It's not just about, as I say, not just about the cost. Yes, it's possible the cost may be higher with another party. It's also the terms that would come in associated with that, the covenants that may be introduced, the restrictions on what the management team can do with the financing, restriction on the business plan, restriction on the capital plan. We have a very good business plan that we've worked now a couple of years on developing. We're in the market getting ready to launch and introducing a scenario where, so as I'm trying to say is that the cost is one issue, but also it would have to be a situation where we're able to find someone that's offering us this seed type of funding with the terms comparable to Rascom is offering.
I mean, the notion in the next sentence, we cannot accept financing on commercially unreasonable terms. To me, the term commercially unreasonable is an oxymoron. If it's commercial, it's whatever the market will bear. If it's unreasonable, then if you're saying there's no market.
Yeah, that's
a different story if there's no market than if there is a market, but it's a higher cost to you. And that's what I don't quite understand.
Commissioner Katz, if I may just add a comment here. I don't think when we said they were commercial, these terms, they're commercial in a good market. I don't think today you go to anyone, you will get the same terms that we have provided to Globalive Wireless. Otherwise, even a little bit more onerous. We would be very happy to have someone take up this debt off our books at similar terms, even a bit more onerous. I don't think, and we have done, as we explained last time, we have done a lot of efforts to try to find such financings. As Tony says, the terms will be not only more onerous, but very, very, very difficult for the business. I mean, the only proposition we saw were, absolutely unacceptable. So when I said last week that they were commercial terms, in a good market, in a very good market, in a very bullish market, we saw the precedents, and we compare these precedents which were done in very bullish market. Today, you would not find, even at 200 or 300 basis points more of these kind of conditions for Globalive Wireless today. And you heard actually the treasurer from, I think it was from Rogers, expressing the same way about our ability to finance ourselves.
Thank you.
Just a couple questions. One, I want to give you an opportunity to address something that I may not be clear on. Mr. Seshak, you said in your argument that the sum of two zeros was still zero. And yet in Mr. Infant's argument, I don't want to put words in his mouth, but I sort of took it that having a lot of influence doesn't necessarily mean control. Now, influence, to me doesn't seem like zero. So I'm trying to understand. I mean, I accept that if I were to accept that each is a zero and I added two zeros together, that I have to come up with zero. To do otherwise is illogical. But I would have to accept the premise that it's a zero in each of these areas, and I would want to give you the opportunity to address that, because my guess is that people on the other side would say, no, you can't call this a zero. There's a lot of influence in this, and there's lots of different analogies you can come up with to work this on, but I want to give you a chance to clarify that, if you understand my question, before we conclude.
Mr. Menzies, perhaps I could take that. I think it's basically a legal question and a question of precedent. I wouldn't argue, perhaps the words were badly chosen, that the levers of influence that have been identified by the incumbent or the commission amount to zero. I wouldn't take that position. I like the 4-foot plank analogy. You can have, as the Canadian Airlines decision says, a number of parties that have significant influence over a company, including its bankers, which is very often the case. Key employees, CEOs often have an awful lot of influence over the company. And significant minority shareholders.
Can you please repeat your comment? So you try to speak closer to the microphone. Thank you.
Would you like me to start all over, or I'll give you the... I don't know. Well, okay. I would say that, in answer to your question, Mr. Menzies, that the proper test is the one that's set out in the Canadian Airlines case, and it very clearly recognizes that while a number of parties have the power to exert influence, and often substantial influence, over a company, that simply does not translate into control until it becomes dominant or determining. In other words, it's like an on-off switch in a light. If a particular player, an actor, can say no and stop an activity from going ahead, either a strategic activity or a significant operational activity, then that could amount to control. But if they can merely say, look, we have a lot of debt, we in this business and that, we don't think we'd feel right if you could do that, but we can't really stop you, then that's influence. That, in my mind, is the distinction between influence and control. If you look at the precedent, it very clearly says it's the power to decide, to determine or dominate, not simply the power to influence. So I do believe that you cannot take a lot of individual influences that, as I said, may be 4-foot planks and use them to cross a 9-foot gap. It just doesn't work.
Thank you. And just have one other question, and that is, in terms of your search for financing and in your search for bridge financing in Canada, did, just so I understand the breadth of it, did that include public or government sources as well as private sources?
When you say public, you mean like government?
Yes.
We did, and I think continue to speak to the Export Development Corporation. That's the only one coming to mind.
Thank you.
Okay, before we wrap up, Mr. Rose, I want to return to you because I found your explanation somewhat difficult to accept. You said you asked for all of these control section questions which have now, or covenants which have now disappeared because you used a standard legal document and they were there, etc. And was only when questioned by the Commission and put them under examination that you felt that they weren't needed. And I accept you, but doesn't that also, why couldn't I take the interpretation also? Why shouldn't I also take the interpretation? You don't need them because you have control anyway, so this was just icing on the cake. Being the largest shareholder and being basically the sole debt holder, you control this company, and therefore making those concessions is really not a meaningful concession. That's how it's being represented by the other intervenants, and I'd like you to have a chance to rebut that.
Well, we can just reiterate that, the debt we have doesn't give us any control over the operation. We have, given very, very flexible terms. I don't personally see how this gives us any control over the operation. I think what I've heard from the incumbents is purely speculation about what would happen, but I've not heard any material argument, any fact that, as per the agreement, we would control with the bridge that were provided the operation of Globalive Wireless. I have not seen any factual argument saying that we control. I mean, we have pushed to the limit of, a lender to give as much, flexibility to Globalive Wireless. We have taken off all the covenants. We have extended the maturity, extended the terms at their option. I don't see what else we could do apart from just, giving free money. We pushed it as hard as we could.
Okay, so thank you very much for your presentations. Now, as I mentioned at the outset, the other parties until the dates that I think it's October 5 and October 7 to come back with further documentary proof or rebuttal of the points that were raised, and we don't want to render our decision by the 23rd as promised. Thank you very much. That ends the proceedings.